Hello, I'm Kathy Obradovich from the Des Moines Register, and we are here today with Senator Kamala Harris, Democratic presidential candidate from California. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you. It's great to be with you guys.
We also have members of the Register editorial board and reporters and editors. Let's just go down the line and introduce yourselves. Please, starting with you, Jay.
Richard Doak, I'm a member of the editorial board.
Rox Laird, editorial board member.
Andy Dominic, editorial writer.
Barbara Rodriguez, politics reporter.
Brian Bonham, Steel politics reporter.
Rachel Stassenberger, I'm the politics editor.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, Senator Harris, and please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running for president.
Sure. Well, I am running for president because I truly believe that we are better than this. You know, I joke, I was raised by a mother who, if you ever came home complaining about something, our mother would look at you and with a straight face, she would ask, well, what are you going to do about it? So I decided to run for president of the United States. I know what we are capable of. I know who we are. I believe in the ideals that were the basis of our founding. I believe in all that we said we were and who we are when, you know, we wrote the Constitution of the United States and all of its amendments and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and those words we spoke in 1776, that we're all equal and should be treated that way. And I think this is a moment in time where we have to remember that the greatest strength, one of the greatest strengths of who we are as a nation and as a people, is we are aspirational and we have always fought to reach those ideals. We've not yet fully reached those ideals, but the strength of who we are is we fight to get there. And I'm prepared to be a leader who reminds us of that and takes us to that place. And I will tell you, this campaign for me is so much bigger than what I think, at least for Democrats, is the obvious, which is that the current President of the United States should not be in that office. And we can go into more detail about why. But in addition to that, I strongly believe that what's at stake in this election is the very definition of who we are, our standing on the globe, what will be our strength. Because, you know, even if November of 2016 had turned out differently, we would still be a nation in flux. We would still be a world in flux. We are witnessing ascending and descending economies around the globe and globalization. We are seeing shifting populations around the globe like we've never seen, in large part because of the climate crisis. We're in the midst of an industrial revolution, a digital revolution. So still before us would be the question about what will be our standing and our definition and our strength. And so part of why I'm running for president is because I know what we are capable of. And it is about also a vision of the future in which everyone can see themselves and no one is left out. So.
Okay, when you say we are better than this, what's the this?
The this
that
is,
you're
yeah,
describing?
this is what we have seen in Donald Trump and his administration. You know, from the beginning of it, which is a campaign that was led by a slogan, "Make America Great Again," which was backward looking, which prompted many of us to ask, back to what? Back before the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act or the Fair Housing Act or federal minimum wage or Roe v. Wade? Because we're not going back. Part of it is based on the fact that from day one, he has used the voice of the office of the President of the United States, because we have to remember this is so much bigger than any one individual. It's about our president and the office of our President of the United States. And he has used the microphone of the President of the United States, which is such a powerful tool, in a way that has been about beating people down instead of lifting people up. And he made a lot of promises he didn't keep. He made promises to working people in America, from farmers to auto workers, that he didn't keep. Trade policy by tweet. Unilateral action. You know, trade by definition means it's more than one of you, right? You're trading. Unilateral action, and I would say, from my opinion, born out of a fragile ego that has resulted in, as we know here in Iowa, Farmers looking at bankruptcy with soybeans rotting in bins. Auto workers were told as many as 300,000 by the end of the year may lose their jobs. American consumers, families are, because of this so-called trade policy, spending $1.4 billion a month more on everything from groceries to washing machines. So what are we better than? We are better than that. We are better in terms of expecting that we have a leader who actually leads in a way that is reflective of one, keeping promises, but also doing the work in the best interest of the people they represent as opposed to self-interest. Let's talk about what else. Let's talk about, he said he was going to help working families and then passes a tax bill benefiting the top 1% and the biggest corporations in this country. It will result in a $1.5 trillion deficit. We can look at the fact that on the issue of the climate crisis, an administration that is deregulating industries across the board, quietly doing it, in the favor of the special interest, who probably half of this administration will go work for when they're out of office. Let's just be honest. And what we see is that, here in Iowa, for example, look at what leadership does, where you have wind turbines and put a focus on that, which is generating 40% of the electricity of this state. But yet, the President of the United States, on an issue that represents an existential threat to who we are, is pushing science fiction instead of science fact, right? Science fact. Science fact is that there was flooding happening in the eastern and western parts of this state. I saw the fields that were underwater. I was there and saw those fields that were underwater in this state.
Still underwater.
And are still underwater. So let's look at what else. Let's look at policies that have been about vilifying whole groups of people, and in particular immigrants. When the guy came in office, we were pretty much at net zero around immigration. But yet there was still this chant about build a wall, and vilifying immigrants and rapists and murderers. Then you see a policy, and I serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee. I serve on Senate Homeland Security Committee in addition to Judiciary and Budget. We've seen policies from this administration. They were not being honest. I asked them continually, do you have a child separation policy? We couldn't get a straight answer. But the American public knows, because of the journalists who have told the truth about what was happening. This administration had a policy that was inhumane, that was about separating children from their parents, about putting babies in cages, which is, from my perspective, a human rights abuse being committed by the United States government. This is not work that is reflective of who we are and our values as a nation.
So his immigration actions have appealed to a lot of people. And a lot of his rhetoric appeals to racist and
Yeah.
White separatist elements in this country.
Yeah.
How would you, as president, bring back civility to this country?
Yeah.
Can it be done, or is the genie out of the bottle?
It can absolutely be
How
done.
would you do it?
It can absolutely be done, and that's what I mean about we are better than this. So first of all, back to that microphone that the president has. It has incredible power. When she holds it in a responsible way, it is about elevating public discourse and speaking to our better angels. It is about speaking to the commonality between us. So here's how I think about it. We've had these powerful forces that are trying to sow hate and division among us and have Americans and us pointing fingers at each other. Well, no. It overlooks the fact that the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And I know that to be true. I know it to be true based on every personal and professional experience I've had. And here's how I think about it. I think about it based on the thoughts and the worries that wake us up in the middle of the night. So I call that the 3 a.m. thought, right? And some people refer to that as the witching hour, right? But in the middle of the night, when you wake up thinking that thought, sometimes in a cold sweat, for the vast majority of us, when we wake up thinking that thought, it is never through the lens of the party with which we're registered to vote. For the vast majority of us, when we wake up thinking that thought, it is never through the lens of some simplistic demographic some pollster put us in. And for the vast majority of us, when we wake up thinking that thought, it has to do with one of just a very few things. Our personal health, the health of our children or our parents. For so many, can I get a job, keep a job, pay the bills by the end of the month, retire with dignity? For our students, can I pay off their student loans? For so many families, can I help my family member get off their opioid addiction? For so many of our seniors, can I afford to pay for my prescription drugs? Or do I have to split my pills or try and get a bus to Canada? The vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And I believe, and I intend, God willing, as President of the United States, to use that microphone in a way that speaks to those truths, because those are truths. And I will say something else. Part of what I believe is at play is that in the process of sowing that hate and division, as you've mentioned, it has made us weaker. It's making us weak. So we talk about China, we talk about strength, we talk about the things that we need to accomplish. Okay, yeah, so when we're talking about China, let's hold them accountable when they steal our intellectual property. Let's hold them accountable when they're dumping cheap products into our commerce. But let's also recognize we need to compete. We need to compete. That means investing in the American people, investing in the American farmer, investing in American businesses, investing in American students, having a plan for infrastructure. Remember Infrastructure Week? Well, I guess we all slept during that. It never happened, right? And so it is also about conducting leadership in a way that is about empowering and strengthening the nation and the people in it. And in that way, bringing people together. You know, so much of what I think he's been able to get away with is to tap into the frustration people are rightly feeling. When we look at the fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has told us, over, you know, and many others, you know, if you look at it, over the next 15 years, up to 40% of the jobs that currently exist will no longer exist. People are aware of that, and they're frustrated. So what does he say? Oh, blame those people. Instead of, hey, let's fix the problem. I believe Americans want a problem-solving president.
What do you do beyond modeling inclusiveness and saying the right things to actually break down, you know, what has been a systemic, centuries-long policies of racism in our government?
Right,
And society.
that's exactly right. So well, there are a number of things. One, we have to speak truth about it. We have to speak truth about it because, to be sure, this issue of, you know, white supremacist or racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, these things are not real, are not new in our country, and they are very real. I know, I as a prosecutor, prosecuted hate crimes. As the Attorney General of California, where I ran the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, I, on an annual basis, published the hate crimes report. So I will tell you, this stuff is not new in our country. It certainly predates the election of Donald Trump, but it has also increased under Donald Trump. And, you know, he's been fueling the flames of hate. And, you know, I've said recently, you know, on the issue of El Paso, you know, no, when people ask me, is he responsible for those killings? Well, no, I mean, he obviously didn't pull the trigger, but he's sure been tweeting out the ammunition. And so how do we deal with it? Let's take it to the point of how we're going to actually address it and work towards solving the problem. There are a number of things that we have to do. One is we have to speak truth about the history. Two, we have to say collectively as a people that whenever and wherever that hate presents itself, that we will all speak out and speak up. We have to also agree as a society that whoever is the target of that hate should never be made to fight alone. And then we have to deal with, to your point, systemic racism. It is real. I look, for example, at the racial wealth gap and have a plan for dealing with that. So I'll be more specific, if I may.
Please.
So on the issue of intergenerational wealth and what that either does to strengthen a family and a community or not, let's take the issue of home ownership. And we don't have to go back, we could go very far back, but I'm going to go back just as far as World War II. So World War II, we had so many Americans who went to go and fight on our behalf. And they came back, and they were coming back, and our government rightly said, let's reward them, that generation, for all the good that they did and the sacrifice they made. And let's look at them as a way to build up the middle class. So we had policies, governmental policies, that were about helping them to buy homes, understanding what that does, right? It is about giving people their peace. It's about their dignity. It's about encouraging their investment in their community and their neighborhood, right? Well, those policies, to a large extent, excluded the black servicemen that were coming back. Then you look at the years of redlining throughout the country, where black families were prohibited from buying homes in certain areas, those areas which usually were the areas that saw the greatest amount of appreciation of the value of the home, had the schools that had the resources and so on, redlining. Then you look at something that I worked on directly, which was the foreclosure crisis that devastated American families, resulting from the crash of Wall Street and the predatory lending practices, right? And what happened there is that, in particular, black, Latino, immigrant families were particularly hard hit during that foreclosure crisis, lost their homes never to be able to buy another one. So what does all this mean? Well, let's put this in the context of this point about intergenerational wealth. The greatest source of wealth for most American families is owning a home. So that home not only represents their hard work and their dignity and their place and their pride, it also represents, hey kid, son and daughter, when you decide to go to college, guess what, sweetheart? Instead of you having to go to that predatory lender, that for-profit lender, I'll take some of the capital out of the home to help you with tuition. Son or daughter, you wonderful smart kid, and you want to go and start a small business and be an entrepreneur, instead of you having to go and take out a loan at awful interest rates, I'm going to give you some money to start it up. Intergenerational wealth. So the systemic racism that existed around home ownership in America has devastated, in particular, African American families in terms of the gap between the wealth that those families have as compared to others. We have to, one, acknowledge the history and then address it. Part of what I'm proposing is that on that subject, for any family that is living in a historically redlined community or in a community, or they're living in federally subsidized housing, that they'll get federal grants to help pay for their down payment and closing costs, to get them into the stream of home ownership. And I'll tell you, when I was dealing with this issue, taking on the 5 big banks of the United States around the foreclosure crisis, there is a lot to be done to correct for all families what have been predatory practices by the banks, by lending institutions, to make sure that we honor what we have always known, which is if you want to build a middle class, one of the specific ways that you will do that is to help people with home ownership.
What
Would you
about
go
the-
as far as some candidates who call for reparations for African Americans?
I believe that we need to have, and I support having a commission that will study the issue, period.
With what expectations, though? I mean, do you, a lot of times, and we've said this at the table before, a commission is something that you do in government to sort of get it off your plate.
Well,
so-
but it's such a complex, I mean, even just this point about that, it took me, I don't know how many minutes, and then if you look at the extent of the research that went into it, to understand the issue about disparities around home ownership, and I only went back to World War II, right? This stuff needs to be studied.
Yeah.
Because America needs a history lesson. Let's be honest about it. And we need to study it in a way that we are having a very comprehensive and fact-based conversation about policies and the connection between those policies and harm if we're going to have a productive conversation. It can't just be, hey, write some checks. But I want to say another point on this because it gets back to your first question. Because also, we have to deal with, writing checks will not deal with systemic issues on everything from housing to education to healthcare, right? Judicial system, criminal justice system, across the board. So that is why I support studying the issue in a way we've not done before. We've actually not done it.
So you're not ruling it out?
What is it that we're talking about? Ruling what out? Well, what does that mean? This is, I guess, my point also.
You said writing a check.
Yeah, so if we're talking about writing a check, I don't think it is that simple. And frankly, I don't support an idea or a notion that after all of this, we're going to say, okay, I'm going to write you a check and then be quiet. Because that won't solve the problem, which is the systemic issues that are present and will continue to exist whether or not you write a check. So I'm just saying it's just not that simple. And I don't buy into an argument that it is. So.
Some people argue that the conversation that we're having right now actually plays right into Donald Trump's hands. And there were actually some Democrats, prominent Democrats in Iowa after the 2016 election who said, the Democrats are focusing too much on racial politics, too much on identity politics, not enough on the economy of rural America, and that is hurting them. What do you say to that, first of all? And second of all, let's talk a little bit about the economy of rural America.
Let's do that. And let's do it in a way that appreciates the earlier point. When the vast majority of us wake up at 3 in the morning with that thought that's been weighing on us, it's the same thought. It's about health care. It's about how we're going to pay the bills by the end of the month. It's about our kids' education. These are the things. So I say that to say I reject the notion that to talk about one thing is to the exclusion of another. I reject that notion. And I think it's a mistake for Democrats, to your point, to fall into a trap that suggests that to care about and prioritize the economic health and well-being of families is to the exclusion of also acknowledging the issues of, as we just started the discussion, issues like, racism or anti-Semitism or homophobia, right? I just reject the idea that we cannot have a conversation that includes all of the priorities and acknowledging all of the truths. So on the issue of the economy, let's talk about that for a moment. Almost half of American families right now are a $400 unexpected expense away from complete upheaval. The Federal Reserve tells us that. Almost half of American families, $400 unexpected expense. And I'd like to also tie that to another point, which is the failure of this administration to deal with infrastructure. How are these points connected? Well, let's think about this for a moment. And let's add in to the issue spotting on this issue the real issue in America of affordable housing. Okay, I was just with some folks who are living in mobile homes where their rents have been increased. In fact, we did an op-ed. Their rents were increased by 69%, and they got 60 days notice. Okay, so $400 unexpected expense. People can't live, a lot of people can't afford to live where they work. So they're in a car commuting for a couple of hours in many places. Let's talk about infrastructure. America's infrastructure is 100 to 150 years old. What's the point, Kamala? We got a lot of potholes. So that means that family has to drive over all those potholes to work to pay the bills. You know what potholes cause? Flat tires. You know how much 4 tires cost? That takes us back to that $400 unexpected expense. These issues are connected. So I'm proposing, one, that we have a robust infrastructure plan, and I can go into more detail about what that looks like, including a plan for rural America, including a plan for water infrastructure, which is a huge issue for Iowa, including as part of my water plan, knowing that up to 40% of Iowa families have well water, and so doing a municipal infrastructure plan will not be enough. We also have to give individual families grants to upgrade their wells. Okay, but in addition, part of what I'm proposing and prepared to do is to change the tax code so that families that are making less than $100,000 a year as a family, they'll receive a tax credit of up to $6,000 a year that they can collect and take home at up to $500 a month, which will be all the difference between those families getting through the end of the month or not. These are part of the issues that we have to face. On the point about affordable housing and rent, in 99% of the counties in America, if you're a minimum wage worker working full time, you cannot afford market rate for a one-bedroom apartment. I'm prepared to say that renters who are paying more than 30% of their income in rent plus utilities get a tax credit. Because, and you know, and I'll tell you maybe just to head off to the past if anyone wants to talk about it. You know, this whole conversation, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Well, I can talk to you specifically about how we're going to pay for a number of these things, including repealing that tax bill that benefits the top 1% and the biggest corporations of America. But let's also understand, when that family can't get through the month because of that $400 unexpected expense, they're probably part of the 12 million people last year that had to take out a loan of, on average, $400 from the payday lender at an interest rate often in excess of 300%. That is a cycle that will doom that family financially.
So is there anything the federal government can do in the way of regulating banks to encourage or incentivize or somehow help banks to provide unusurious lending rates
Yeah,
to these families?
absolutely, and that is a very big part of it, which is it's about Glass-Steagall, it's about what we need to do. You know, and I've been a part of this process of saying that banks have to play by the rules in a way that they're engaged in fair business practices. When I was Attorney General of California, like I said, I took on the 5 big banks of the United States. And I would sit across at some fancy conference table where they, you know, essentially say things like, well, the homeowners are trying to steal from us. The gall, trying to steal from our shareholders. And I looked at them and said, you know what, you know who my shareholders are? Those homeowners. And you're trying to do it. And so we passed what we call the California Homeowner Bill of Rights, which actually became a national model that other states passed, which says, talks about the rights that homeowners have. Rights like having a single point of contact at the bank. So if they're going through foreclosure, they don't have to talk to a variety of different people who give them different information, which confuses them and may lead to the foreclosure of their home. We put in place rules. But the other part of it is also just addressing the fact that we have to operate regulations from an assumption, which I believe is a correct assumption, which is that the vast majority of families are working hard and playing by the rules and not receiving the benefit of what the American dream should offer. You know, there's a whole other conversation happening about, you know, which I kind of reject because I don't, the priorities for me I don't think of as being based on an ideological spectrum. It really is based on just what is waking up people in the middle of the night. But, you know, on the subject of that has come up in the conversation in the presidential race about, you know, capitalism or socialism. Look, I believe in capitalism. And it is not working in America for most families. Because over a period of many decades, the rules have been written in a way that have not benefited working families. And we have to correct for that. I mean, I'll give you another example of a problem. And it was you've heard me say this, Barb, it was my first, I think it was the first visit to Iowa as a presidential candidate. I've been here before. And I was talking to a group of teachers. And it crystallized for me the number of teachers around our country who are working 2 and 3 jobs because they can't pay the bills on a teacher's salary. So then I learned 94% of the teachers in public schools in our country are coming out of their own back pocket to help pay for school supplies. That teachers on average make 11% less than similarly educated professionals.
You proposed federal action to raise teacher pay.
Yes.
An average of $13,500.
In Iowa, the teacher pay gap is $12,200 a year.
One thing I was going to ask is there a geographic difference
Yes.
here where people in
Yes.
Iowa whose cost of living is less maybe get less than teachers in California?
So the national average is 13,500, but we have done the analysis state by state, because it is about, for that teacher, are they being paid similar to other professionals? So because right now they're being paid 11% pretty much across the board less than similarly educated professionals. So here in Iowa, it's $12,200 a year.
How would that work when, that's typically a state matter, how much money is going into teacher salaries and how much they get paid. Is it just a federal stipend? Is it a tax credit? How does that work?
Matching funds.
Matching funds.
So 3 to 1. And the reality of it is that we can have this conversation about states versus federal on the issue of education, but I'm here to tell you, and I feel very strongly about this, it is a national problem. We are failing our children across the board in public education. We have over a period, when I was in elementary school, back in the old days, my first grade teacher, not so long ago, but long enough that things have changed drastically since, right? Where we're not funding and supporting public education. When then we have somebody like Betsy DeVos, who is more concerned with grizzly bears than teachers, wants to put a gun in the hand of a teacher instead of giving them a raise, and this shift towards the privatization of what is an essential government function. There are 3 essential government functions: public education, public safety, and public health. We are failing on public education, and we are collectively paying a price. Back to the point about our need to compete. Like, this is real. And this is part of the failing of this president and this administration at this moment in time. You pass these ridiculous policies around trade that are bankrupting farmers. And then meanwhile, you've got a Secretary of Education that wants to privatize the whole thing. Meanwhile, we have nations around the world that are doing so much better in investing in their children and their students. And we are going to lose our competitive edge. One could argue we already have. So on this issue, back to the point about whose responsibility is it? Of course it's states, local. I believe in local school districts and their ability to make decisions about the needs of their communities, but this has got to be a national priority. It has to be, because it's a national crisis, as far as I'm concerned.
A lot of times states are, like Iowa, are reluctant to buy into federal matching funds because they feel like, this is not a sustainable source of funding. We can't trust the federal government to keep paying, and we'll get stuck with the cost in the end. I mean, I would be very, very surprised if the current Iowa legislature would buy into a plan like that and agree to participate.
You know what, listen, I know the conversations that I'm having with the families of Iowa, the teachers, members of school districts, and they are suffering. I mean, rural communities are having a hard time recruiting and retaining teachers because of the salary issue. And part of my plan is that for rural communities, the so-called hard to reach or high need communities, they'll actually get even a higher salary, because we have to recruit and retain. Those families in rural America and in rural Iowa, I mean, the conversations I'm having with them is, one, the sadness and pain that comes along with the students and the children of those communities leaving because there are no opportunities, because there's not been adequate investment in those communities. And one of the ways to start with an investment is to invest in the public education in those communities, to give those kids what they deserve to meet their capacity. Their capacity is high, but we are not resourcing it to meet their capacity.
I want to make sure I ask you about this because of your position on the Senate Intelligence Committee. What are your recommendations for addressing the Russian interference in the 2016 election. I mean, even if you take out the whole idea of Trump campaign collusion, et cetera, you've still got this foreign power interfering in our
You're absolutely right.
What
You're
should
absolutely
we do
right.
about that?
So I serve on the Senate Intelligence Committee, as you said. We meet on a regular basis in what's called a SCIF, which is a secure room, no cell phones, no cameras. It is probably the best place in the United States Congress to see bipartisan work. Because the one thing we all have in common, I believe, is a priority on the security of our homeland and national security. So I cannot talk to you about the details of what I hear in that room, but I will tell you that a product of what has been discussed in that room are public reports from the intelligence community and from our committee about the fact of Russia's interference in the election of the President of the United States. Yet Donald Trump prefers to take the word of the Russian president over the word of the American intelligence community on this issue, to our demise. And let's back up and realize what happened. A historic adversary, Russia, trying to figure out how can I take away some of the strength of that place called the United States of America. Well, one of the strengths that they've got, and it's intangible almost, you can't really touch it, but it's strong. When they walk in the room, it's their strength, is that they are a democracy. Imperfect though we may be, right? Flawed though we may be, it's part of our strength. How can we nip at that? Well, one of the greatest pillars of a democracy, especially ours, free and open elections. We are very proud of the fact. We've not had any revolutions in recent history. It is through a peaceful transition of power through elections. Our election system, imperfect and flawed though it may be. So they decide to go at that. Well, let's get the American people going at each other to create division and a lack of confidence in this process. And they test out a bunch of subjects. And interestingly enough, the subject that gained the most amount of heat was race. And they had people going at each other. This is all in the, you read the reports and you will see that this is what happened. So, but the fact is Russia interfered. So there were, for the first 2 years that I've been there were 2 members of the United States Senate who were both on Senate Intelligence and Senate Homeland Security Committee. And we were then together receiving the same information from these 2 perspectives and 2 sets of agencies. The fellow I'm speaking of is a Republican senator from Oklahoma. And he and I looked at each other and said, let's do something together on this. So together with some other of our colleagues, many others, bipartisan, we came up with a bill which is to secure America's elections infrastructure, which, by the way, the previous Secretary of Homeland Security designated as critical infrastructure in the United States. Meaning when you have the thought about what is critical infrastructure, our election system is one of them. Came up with a bill. Let's fortify the states. Let's get resources. Let's strengthen the system. Mitch McConnell will not put it on the floor for a vote. It's a bipartisan bill about strengthening America's elections infrastructure, about strengthening our ability to have a real functional democracy, and they won't put it on the floor for a vote. There's all kinds of speculation about why. But, listen to Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, who now several months, maybe many months ago, told us, 2020, we're going to see it again, and probably with increased vigor. And we already know that. I know that from my campaign. And so, part of the challenge is going to be for all of us as Americans to, frankly, to use a colloquialism, to not get played. To not be tempted into those discussions that are trying to appeal to some base emotion, but instead to focus on facts, to know the facts, to learn the facts, to, go to trusted sources of information such as you, because I do have a very serious concern, as many of us do.
So what exactly would that bill do that McConnell won't?
It would give federal funding to states to strengthen the election systems, and in particular to transition to paper ballots. Imagine that. We're going back to the point where, because guess what? Russia can't hack a piece of paper. And so that's what it would do. So we would make sure that we have redundancies in the system, and in particular paper ballots, because there are many strengths to technology, and then there are weaknesses. And one of them is that it can be manipulated and even remotely manipulated.
There again, as Kathy mentioned about education, the elections are basically a local decision.
Right. Right.
So some states will do it, some won't, probably.
Well, but remember, we came up with, there are some issues where just the history of our country, we learned that the federal government had to get involved because states were violating people's civil rights, right? And so that's, and so we do have to, on this issue, certainly we have seen that there will be states that will refuse to cooperate, but it is to your point, the best interest of everybody. Because this is about just your vote counts. And is not, and that the outcome of the election is not determined by a foreign country, right?
You talked earlier about how rural communities are losing teachers.
Yeah.
Rural communities in Iowa are also losing doctors.
Yes, that's right.
Obstetricians
I know.
and hospitals.
Yeah.
How would your health care plan deal
Right.
with rural hospitals and
Yeah.
Medicare?
Some people say Medicare for All actually endangers rural hospitals because of the Medicare reimbursement rate. So I include that when you're talking about
Part of what we have to do around, so I'd like to talk in a broad sense also about my priorities for rural America and rural communities. On the issue of health care, there's no question that the reimbursement rates are a huge problem. And because the reimbursement rates reward high volume so that you can keep the lights on. And in rural communities, it is not that. It's going to be smaller populations of people that still need an infrastructure and still need the lights to be on. So we do have to reform the reimbursement rates. There's no question. There is also the work that we need to do around the health care for rural America that is about broadband. Because it's about telemedicine also. Telemedicine, even for other parts of America that are not rural, has proven to be a very efficient and effective way at delivering health care. And so that's part of my priority for rural America, is to really get broadband going. And if you'll allow me the details, do it in a way that is not only about underground wires, but is also about satellite. I would put out a bid to get some kind of hybrid of a combination of satellite and underground, but building up the broadband infrastructure. And also it's going to have to be about, to your point about obstetricians and other specific professionals, creating incentives, also about what we do around medical schools and loan forgiveness and things of that nature to create incentives for those professionals to be there. And the other way that I think about healthcare in rural America is this. And I'll just share with you a personal story. My mother passed away from cancer. And what I know is happening in rural America is that because those specialists are not there, family members cannot be near a family member who is going through an acute illness. And that's just, that pains my heart, that a family would have to send their relative hundreds of miles away where the expert, where the specialist will be. And they can't afford to be there every day. And those of us who have gone through this, there's nothing more comforting to a family member than to have their family around them on a consistent basis, showing up at that hospital, being by their side. And so I think of this issue through that lens as well, and we've got to do better.
Talk a little more about your health plan.
Yeah.
And do you advocate Medicare Advantage plans as part of this? Just tell us.
Yeah, sure. So my Medicare for All plan is that, one, everyone will shift into a Medicare program, that folks will get 10 years to transition in, that we will have rules that private and public plans are allowed, but private insurers are going to have to play by our rules. So they will not be able to charge any longer deductibles. They will not be able to charge any longer co-pays. Under my Medicare plan, we will extend benefits so that, unlike Medicare now, we will include vision, dental, and hearing aids. And it will cover everyone. And our experts have been saying that our plan is probably, including the author of the Affordable Care Act, have said that our plan is probably the most effective way to get everybody into a health care plan as quickly as possible. We estimate that by the first 5 years, the majority of Americans will be in our plan.
So the difference, the Wall Street Journal gave you a little bit of praise, or there was an op-ed this weekend, that's what caught my eye about this. So the difference from other candidates is you want both private, within Medicare, you want
Yes.
to go ahead and keep using the
Private,
plan.
yes, the private plans, but they have to play by our rules because, look, I mean, last year alone, the top 8 pharmaceutical and insurance companies profited $72 billion. They've been jacking up prices, and the American consumer has been paying for it. And it's both the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies. So, yes, private insurers can be a part as long as they play by the rules, and that means bringing down cost. And so if they want to compete and bring down cost, they're in. Yeah.
So what's the cost?
Basically,
What does it cost to the federal treasury?
overall, it's going to cost less than it does now. Right now, we're spending $3 trillion, and we estimate over the next 10 years it's going to be $6 trillion. So the cost of doing nothing is much more expensive. And we're talking about also bringing down the cost of what we are doing now, which is that right now we do have a Medicare for All system, and it's called the emergency room, and that's extremely expensive. The other thing that we're going to do as part of our plan is that babies will be born into the Medicare for All system. And so there are about 4 million babies born a year in our country. They'll automatically get in. You know, one of the issues right now is that pediatricians are not in Medicare because children are not in Medicare. So we're going to fold, and otherwise 91% of the doctors that are in America are in Medicare. Those that are not are predominantly pediatricians, with some being cosmetic surgeons. But under our plan, immediately once they're born, babies will be in the system, and that will bring the pediatricians in.
So one of your opponents says it's going to cost $30 trillion. What's he talking about?
I'm not sure which opponent you're talking about, but if it is who I think of, yeah, we're also, I mean, I see huge flaws with the plan that he's also presenting, including that almost 10 million people, even by his plan's own admission, will not be covered. And the cost of that is far too expensive. In America today, 30 million Americans are not covered by insurance, not covered by health care.
Let's talk about criminal justice here for a minute.
Good.
First of all, some Democrats have tried to go at your record as a prosecutor.
Mhm.
They've argued that while you did some progressive things while you were in office, that you were also kind of part of the lock 'em up society, where there was a trend toward longer incarceration, the war on drugs, all of that. I want you to respond to that, which you've heard criticism of that, but also I'd like to hear your plans for what are the priorities for reforming criminal justice?
Mm-hmm. So, I want to start by saying that I reject a notion that suggests that all communities don't want public safety. All communities want public safety. All communities want to know that their grandmother can walk to church and be safe. All communities want to know that if their house is burglarized, that they can call 911 and immediately a police officer will show up. All communities want to know that if a child is molested, a woman is raped, or one human being kills another human being, that there will be serious and severe consequence. So I operate from that premise, based on my years of experience. I am a child of the civil rights movement. My parents met when they were actively engaged in that movement. I grew up with not a black man I know, be he a relative, a friend, or a coworker, who has not been the subject of some form of discrimination or profiling. When I made a decision to become a prosecutor, it was a very conscious decision. And the decision was to be in a system in a way that I can be a voice for the vulnerable, give protection to those who are vulnerable, and also reform a system that has often been informed by bias. And I'm very proud of the work that I did. I was one of the first prosecutors in the country in elected office to create a reentry initiative that we called Back on Track, that was focused on young men who were selling drugs at low levels and would have otherwise been felons for life. And I designed a program that was about getting them jobs and counseling and support. And in the process, we reduced their recidivism or reoffense rate to such an extent that the United States Department of Justice designated my program as a model of innovation for law enforcement in the United States. As the Attorney General of the United States, of California, but representing an office that is the second largest Department of Justice in the United States, I was one of the first, I believe, state law enforcement agencies to require my special agents to wear body cameras and keep them on. I am proud of the work that I did creating the first in the nation training for police officers on racial bias and procedural justice. So I will tell you that there is no question that we need to reform America's criminal justice system in a way that I wrote about. I wrote a book back in 2008 based on my belief about what we need to do about criminal justice policy. And my perspective is that for too long we've offered a false choice that suggests you're either soft on crime or tough on crime, instead of asking, are we smart on crime? Which means public safety should be our goal, and then how do we best achieve that? And what I know is we need to put more into prevention than we do in reaction if we really want to increase public safety. That's been the work I've done. As president, I will have a unique ability, knowing the system from the inside out, to be able to impact and effectuate change in a way that is about positive reform. I will, for example, do what this president has not done, which is conduct robust oversight over agencies that have been proven to engage in discrimination. This administration has essentially shut down the oversight of consent decrees, where courts are in the process of overseeing reforms. This administration has essentially shut down pattern and practice investigations. I will renew those. I am a leader in the United States Senate on what we need to do to reform the money bail system in America. Why? Well, because there are people in America every day, including here in Iowa, that are sitting in jail waiting to go to trial simply because they don't have enough money to pay bail. Meanwhile, the person who's got money is out enjoying their life. That's not only a criminal justice reform issue and a criminal justice issue, it's an economic justice issue. So I'm a leader on doing that. And then I can go on and on, but there are a number of things that need to happen, and that the president has a unique ability, especially through the United States Department of Justice, to do this work, and I intend to do that work.
Are there things, though, that you did as prosecutor that you regret now, that you, one example that comes to mind is pushing for legislation that really got tough on truancy and got tough on parents for truancy. Are there aspects of that criticism that has been leveled at you that you take to heart, and that you would do actually, consciously do something different when you were president?
Well, first of all, let me say this. It's really important to understand that we have to act when we see children who are not receiving the benefit of everything they deserve by our society and our government. So let me tell you about the issue of truancy. As district attorney, I saw an incredibly high number of young men under the age of 25 who were killed, mostly through gun violence. And there was a reaction that's, okay, let's put more police on the streets, let's do this, let's do that. And I said, well, wait a minute, who are these young men? And I had my team do an analysis. Who are they? And I learned 94% of them were high school dropouts. I then went over to the school district and I learned that of the chronically and habitually truant students, 40% were elementary school students that were missing 50, 60, up to 80 days of a 180-day school year. I learned that an elementary school truant is 3 to 4 times likely to be a high school dropout. That at the time, 82% of the prisoners in the United States were high school dropouts. That an African American man who was a high school dropout between the age of 30 and 34 is 2/3 likely to be in jail, have been in jail, or dead. And when I looked at this situation, I saw that the school district and the system in general was not doing enough to make sure our kids were in school every day. I learned the significance of 3rd grade reading level. Let me tell you about that. If by the end of 3rd grade a child is not at 3rd grade reading level, they literally drop off. Because before 3rd grade, a child is learning how to read, then comprehension kicks in, and they're reading to learn. If they've not learned how to read, they can't read to learn. And it's at that moment, that inflection moment, really around the end of 3rd grade, that you start to see the drop-off. That's elementary school. So I took the issue on. And as a result of taking that issue on, we increased attendance by over 30%. Not one parent went to jail. And it ended up putting the pressure that rightly should have been put on the system and the whole of society to say, pay attention to these kids. Just because they're not from the rich neighborhoods with, so-called powerful people as parents, doesn't mean that they have any less capacity to learn and thrive.
I want to make sure to ask you about court. As member of the Judiciary Committee, you've seen this whole process of where Republicans have taken the court and the Supreme Court. Do Democrats play the same game? Are you going to look for ways to pack the court with progressive judges? Do you have a litmus test for abortion? Or do you try to take the system back to where it was a less partisan time in terms of confirming judges who may not match your ideology but who are qualified?
That's a lot to
Yes,
unpack.
it is a
Okay, I
lot.
will try. Let's start with.
Do you play tit for tat and try?
Well,
try
no,
the
of course we don't
Republicans'
pay
game to
tit
pack-
for tat. However, here is the reality also. Under the Republican rule of the Senate, they held hostage Merrick Garland for, I think it was 9 months, slowing down the process of the United States Supreme Court being able to do its job. And, no, Democrats historically don't play that kind of game. At the same time, we have to understand that we are talking about America's system of justice, and it should not be influenced by politics. And it should be balanced. What I have seen during my time on the Senate Judiciary Committee is, yes, you're right. The court has been packed. I've seen nominees who have been found to be less than well qualified by a neutral nonprofit professional organization, but yet appointed to lifetime appointments. The list just coming and being funneled by the Federalist Society. And as someone who, I've been actively involved in the justice system, I find it absolutely contrary to how we designed our system of justice. Nobody should have to walk into a courtroom and feel that they're not going to get a fair break because the person sitting up on high in the black robe was chosen based on their ideology as opposed to their ability to be unbiased and fair. And I don't know that people are going to have that kind of confidence based on the type of folks that have been nominated by this president.
What's the solution to that? Do you add people on the court who are, for example, not confirmed through the partisan process, as some have suggested? Do you just add more justices?
Well, part of the solution is that, first of all, elections matter. Let's just start there. Elections matter. The president gets to nominate her, right? Nominees to these various positions, most of which are lifetime appointments. The Senate, whoever is in the majority, gets to decide whether the nominee will come up for a hearing and whether they'll come up for a vote. It's just the way we designed our system. That is part of the beauty and the pain of our democracy. And so that is that. So part of what we have to do is we all have to decide, those of us who believe that this is one of the most important aspects of who is president and who is in the United States Senate. We have to say, hey, let's get activated to participate in what's going to be the outcome of that election.
It sounds like you're sort of conceding that the courts are just going to be politicized, though, and that the people who are in office.
No, I'm saying that if we want to talk about the various angles by which we address the problem, this is one of them, which is get involved in elections. Because I can't tell you how many, I've been a surrogate for many people who have run for president. And I've stood in many living rooms, and I will tell you the most important and the least persuasive reason to get people engaged is the United States Supreme Court. And that's just a fact. So that's why I'm saying that one is that we have to have people pay, if they care about what will be the outcome of Roe v. Wade, if they care about Janus and what will be the outcome around organized labor, if you care about Citizens United and what will be the influence of money in politics, if you care about these things, care about the United States Supreme Court, and then care about the elections for both president and who's going to serve in the United States Senate. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, to answer your question, no, I don't have a litmus test, but on Roe v. Wade, I will not appoint anybody who does not honor precedent of Roe v. Wade. And, this is the shocking thing. Again, what I've seen in my short time in the United States Senate, the number of nominees who would not even admit that Brown v. Board of Education was precedent. Shocking. Talk about, and I really have to just make these connections, if you'll allow me. You know who was a champion of Brown v. Board of Education? A fellow by the name of Earl Warren, who was a Republican, and I will say as a point of pride, a former Attorney General of California. And Earl Warren, in 1954, a Republican, said on the issue of how race has impacted education and segregation. This is so fundamental to our core about what we deem to be equality and justice that it is critical that we have a unanimous decision by the court, because it was such a fundamental issue. And if you read history about what he did in spending the time to make sure it would be unanimous so we could say to the world and each other, this was not a debatable point. This was not a political point. And so, it does not have to be about political affiliation, but it does have to be about saying you cannot have your political agenda or ideology be the reason that you're appointed and the vision through which you serve.
I want to be respectful of your time, and is there any last quick questions before we just take 1 minute and wrap up if you'd like?
Okay, no questions? No? Okay.
I have a quick question. I know that this 5-day bus tour that you're doing is kind of focused on what you call kitchen table issues. There's a portion of Democrats around the country and in Iowa who want that kind of structural change, they want that conversation for the 2020 election. What do you say to them when they come up to you and say, that's more important to me, or needs to be part of the conversation?
Well, what I'm hearing from Iowans is thank you for having an agenda that is about transforming my life. Because when we're talking about systemic change around making sure that families can get through the end of the month and pay their bills, when we're talking about upgrading America's public education system, when we're talking about focusing on infrastructure, when we're talking about addressing climate crisis, these are transformational issues. And I'm not thinking about issues through an ideological lens. I'm not trying to, upend markets, but I am trying to have a profound impact on improving the life and the quality of life of American working families.
Right. You've talked about rejecting ideology before, but for Americans and for voters who want to know how you're going to be approaching issues, I mean, what is your guiding light? How do you approach solving those problems for people who want to know how you'll be addressing things?
It's truly about through the lens of what wakes people up in the middle of the night. It is very important to I'll just say this. I fully intend to win this election. And at the end of the day, the most important thing that I believe any of us in public service in particular can do is to be relevant. Relevant in the lives of the people we represent. And that is why I'm enjoying, being in Iowa and the campaign, because I'm listening. I mean, it is through that process that I came up with our plan for Medicare for All. I'm listening, and I want to make sure that the priorities that we have are your priorities, are American families' priorities, and that's how I think, and that's how I think about issues.
Okay, thank you. Just take a minute, and if you'd like to wrap up.
Okay. Do I look in the camera?
Oh,
No. Like what's happening?
Just tell us. Yeah, no, just tell us.
Listen, I love being in this state. It was great to be at the state fair this weekend, and I will keep coming back. We have over 65 people on our team in Iowa and state. We are on the eve of opening our 7th office here, and Iowa has helped me be a better candidate. And what I just so love and admire is, people showing up and who not just, for my campaign, they're doing it, and they've been doing it for generations, showing up to make sure that we are challenged and that we are listening and that we are relevant. And there's such a tradition of doing that in Iowa. And I really do believe it is part of really the best of the traditions we have as a country about ensuring that we're a democracy, meaning of the people, for the people, and by the people. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to encourage you, thank you for watching, first of all, and encourage you to please come back to DesMoinesRegister.com for more candidate interviews. You'll see the schedule, and also for all the news about the Iowa caucuses. Thank you.